Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, we're joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden from beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, there is a fascinating debate going on right now in Ghana following President John Mahama's visit to Beijing last week. A lot of discussion about this free trade agreement. Now, you recall earlier in the year, China announced that all 53 African countries, except, of course, Eswatini, that still recognizes Taiwan, will have duty-free access into the Chinese market. At the same time, countries like Kenya and Ghana are also negotiating more extensive free trade agreements. And in some cases, there's talking about two-way free trade agreements, so duty-free access for Ghanaian goods into the Chinese market, and in return, duty-free access for Chinese goods into the Ghanaian market. President Mahama, when he spoke in Beijing on this, said that he expects that negotiations will end sometime before the end of the month.
Between 2020 and 2024, China's exports to Ghana rose by nearly 46%, while Ghana's exports to China increased by over 11%. China's decision to grant zero tariff access to Ghanaian and African products signals the confidence in our partnership. It opens vast new markets for Ghanaian exporters, agro-processors, and manufacturers. And I'm happy to inform you that we reached agreement in principle, and we have targeted the end of October to be able to sign off on the zero tariff principle. I wish to commend the government of China for this act of solidarity. We are all aware that the multilateral rules-based trading system is being upended by unilateral slapping of tariffs on different countries. This is a time for us to solidarize and to come together, and this initiative by China is very timely.
So throwing a little shade there towards Donald Trump and the Americans for the tariffs that were imposed on Ghana and for the cessation of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which expired in September, which allowed duty-free access into the U.S. market. Now, this is great because political leaders are defending what John Mahama is saying. They're saying this is fantastic to be able to have this access between Ghana and China for products. However, in the business community, there are some concerns about this, specifically on one side of the business community. The people importing, they like this. The people producing, not so much. Let me read you a quote from some of the coverage, Cobus, that took place in the national media. Akosua Osei-Bonsu is the CEO of a large garment producer, and she told Joy News FM, and let me just quote here, "Zero tariffs to China is great, but what about the zero tariffs coming from China? We need strong local protections now, or the flood of cheaper Chinese goods will wipe out Ghanaian industries before we even begin exporting." That was the same sentiment as well that was expressed by Mark Badu Abogi, who is the CEO of the Ghana National Chamber of Commerce and Industry, speaking on Joy News TV. And he was talking also about the fact that there is a structural imbalance between Ghana and China, that ultimately Ghanaian products can never compete with the price and quality of Chinese products, given the scale of Chinese manufacturing.
Then you can benefit from that market. In fact, the major beneficiaries of trade are those who add value. In Ghana, what value do we add to the product? All the things we have been exporting to China are all in their raw form. And then they will rather add value. Cocoa, we export either semi-processed, they add value, and then we go and import, and even at a higher price. So there is no way when it comes to the manufacturers, we'll be able to compete with China. In fact, our cost of production here no way matches out with that of China. The electricity alone, Ghana, electricity per kilowatt hour for a manufacturing company is over 10 cents. In China, it's less than 5 cents. Yeah. Labor, they have it. They have the raw materials. So right from start, if you want to compete with them, they are out. He has given us information. For me, it's very important. And I expect that this information should have given to us much earlier, so that we'll be able to inform our members and also prepare ourselves for such a trade deal.
Okay, so lots of anxiety there. Also, one other quote that, Cobus, I wanted to bring your way. Professor Peter Quardy, who's a prominent Ghanaian economist, he said that the removal of tariffs only addresses price. The real obstacle is non-tariff barriers, the quality, labeling, and inspection standards required by China. If Ghanaian firms cannot meet those standards consistently, the zero tariff is merely a theoretical advantage that will go unused. So there you have it, Cobus. Lots of different opinions, a big discussion going on in Ghana right now, but that's the same discussion that's actually happening across Africa right now as they evaluate how to best take advantage of this new duty-free access into China and what it means at the time when the Chinese are also surging exports into Africa.
The a lot of this depends, or it also affects the structural positioning of Africa in the global economy. This kind of structural positioning of African countries as largely exporting raw materials, struggling to kind of get up the ladder of value beneficiation, and importing finished products back in. Of course, that this is this larger kind of economic reality that Africa is facing, and then the strength of the Chinese manufacturing sector on top of that then makes this challenge so much bigger. And as you know, the president was also pointing out, it's happening within the context of this of massive global trade disruption. So the general kind of calculus around the free trade area, as itself, I think, been kind of upended to a certain extent. The question then becomes, what options African countries have to try and hedge these industries that they do have to not just be washed away, kind of something like the garment industry, for example, but by Chinese imports, while also in the larger sense, throwing their lot into free, kind of free trading.
Cobus, so this question of who gets to shape the discussions in a place like Ghana over trade with China is very interesting. And as we can see right now, there are a lot of stakeholders. And this has been one of the problems when we've looked at the China-Africa relationship over the past 15, 20 years that you and I have been doing this show, is too often there's this discussion about China and about Africa, and that flattens both of these very, very diverse constituencies. And there's a lot of nuance when we start to put the magnifying glass into, say, Ghana, and we look at all the different stakeholders, academics, the business community, government, policymakers, the bureaucracy. All sorts of people have a stake in this debate. And that's why when there was an article that came out earlier this year, the study of agency in Africa-China relations, the case for typologies, written by our old friend Folashadé Soulé, who's a senior research associate at the Global Economic Governance Program in the School of Government at the University of Oxford. I immediately sent her an email and said, we need you to come on and help us explain this question of agency. And conveniently today, she is joining us from Accra in Ghana. Welcome back to the program. Wonderful to see you, Folashadé.
Likewise. Thank you for having me, Eric. Cobus.
It's great to have you and wonderful to see you. And again, just to pick up, this is a topic that you have been studying for years. Back in 2022, you wrote an article for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, negotiating local business practices with China in Benin. And then in 2019, we're really dating ourselves now, how to negotiate infrastructure deals with China, 4 things African governments need to get right. This is a topic that you have developed a real specialty in, and this role of negotiation and also agency do intersect. I think for our non-academic viewers and listeners, maybe we can start our discussion with what is agency when we talk about it? We talked about the different roles, say, in Ghana in this debate over trade, but maybe for the premise of our discussion, you can help us understand what you mean by the word agency and what it's widely perceived to be.
Indeed, I would say that the concept of agency has often been considered as vague. And as you rightly mentioned, there has been an increased use of it, but it hasn't been systematically subject to definition or analysis. Agency has often been confused with choice. initiative, motivation, will. And in studying Africa in international politics, agency is also used sometimes interchangeably with influence, power across a range of fields, including those that you mentioned earlier, and by taking the example of Ghana. So it is used really to describe influence, power across this range of field and phenomena and relationship at different levels and different scales. So the issue with such a definition is that Africa's agency can potentially be identified and celebrated in any context. And that's the reason also behind this article, is that it's important to come up with something more granular. And the definition that I used in this paper is provided by two authors, Obadare and Williams, who argue, I quote, that agency is not just a reactive opposition. It's not just a reaction or a mere opposition to the actions of others. It really should be understood as something, or let's say a premeditated and targeted political or social action that takes place in a particular context. And I'll give examples later on. So there's really some intentionality behind it to address the constraints of a restrictive environment. And it's important to interrogate two elements in such a scenario here. The first one is the intentionality, the why agency. Why is the agency being exercised here? And secondly, the directionality, to whom it is addressed. Let me put more clarity here. When it comes to intentionality, the exercise of agency is not always positive. It's not always something, let's say when a leader, an African leader decides to engage with China or with any other actor for just political reasons or electoral motives to gain votes in a certain district, or also when there's corruption involved. This is also the exercise of agency, but it's not necessarily positive, right? So that's one element. It can be self-interest here, but it can also be directed. Agency can be directed to others as well, to better the situation of or the social conditions of a certain populations, to increase trade, to diversify trade relationship. So it's important to look at these dimensions here and to really take agency as a deliberate act to make profit or take advantage of a particular context or relationship for the actor's interests. And it's another element of agency here is that it's not always formal. Agency can also happen in informal settings. And so it's important in the analysis of agency to encompass, this largely informal action. And one final thing I wanted to say here as well is that coming to the field of Africa-China studies, several authors, including myself, have really aimed, to unpack and locate, the Africa's agency by analyzing how various African state and non-state actors manage this relationship and turn it to their own advantage.
Yeah. Cobus, before we go on, I'd like to get your take on this agency question, because I know this is something that you've studied as well. Maybe you can expand on what Folashadé is saying. What's your definition of agency in the African context?
Well, I think I'm drawing on very similar kind of resources as Folashadé, and the way I think about it is very similar. I think in the sense of different actors' abilities to make things happen, in a space, and to kind of exercise their own will or their own kind of intention, with the proviso that that's not, as Folashadé was pointing out, it's not necessarily collective, or it's not necessarily for the good of anyone except yourself, possibly. Kind of like it's, there's kind of like more and less beneficial ways for the wider community of exercising agency. And in the past, when I was looking at it, as the ability to make things happen, but also the ability to, in some cases, agency is exercised by stopping things from happening, right? Kind of like, for example, by, as one sees frequently with local communities who wake up one day to realize that there's, for example, a big mining project happening on their doorstep, protesting or disrupting or something, is also a form of agency, that then, that may happen kind of on the ground level, but then gets projected upwards kind of through the power relationships as well. So Folashadé, just in a kind of a wider context, like in your paper, and you've pointed out, and also now, you pointed out that there was essentially in Africa-China studies, there's been an agency turn, and in the sense that the way where African agency and global South agency has become a lot more compelling for people, and it's become the focus of a lot more work. Why do you think that turn was necessary?
I think that turn was necessary because much of the literature on Africa-China relations was framed in a sense, at the beginning at least. It was initially focused on more state actors, the capacity of African state actors to prioritize short-term, medium, long-term goals, but with more or less limited influence and mainly acting as rule takers. So there was a whole literature on how these actors base their action through trickery, extraversion. I'm talking here about the early 2000s. And some even quoted that, agency was exerted in tight corners. I think you remember the Lonsdale literature on that one. So I think that at the beginning, this body of work has largely been mobilized to study how African state actors exercise agency or influence at the national state level. But I think the agency turn came here when it also came correlated, I would say, with the increase of engagement at various levels between China and Africa. And not necessarily only government to government. We were seeing parallel initiatives with also non-state actors or within the state apparatus with parliamentarians. Today, like China-Africa relations, the engagement is almost at every level of society. So the agency turned, I would describe it as a way to look at how African actors engage, different categories of African actors, but also at different levels and scales. So I think that there's where really the agency turn came in, because in addition to this engagement came with its own challenges and its own issues. And so agency was exercised at various stages and various levels.
Yeah, one of the best manifestations of that is the triennial Forum on China-Africa cooperation gatherings that happen in one setting. It happens in Africa, then 3 years later it happens in China, and it bounces back and forth. And then in the early part of this engagement, back in the early 2000s, as you talked about, in many cases, we heard that China presented the agenda to African stakeholders and said, this is what we're going to talk about at FOCAC. And then there was no pushback. And then what we saw coming up in the late 2010s and early 2020s was African governments saying, no, this is what we want to talk about. And we saw real outcome shifts take place in FOCAC. Whether that had any material impact on the ground, that'll be an interesting discussion to have with people like you at another time. But it's interesting that the agenda setting moved from rule taker to rule maker, at least in that discussion. And there was a lot, and people like Hannah Ryder at Development Reimagined were working with the African ambassadorial community in Beijing on an agenda setting and whatnot. But it comes back to when we think about China-Africa agency, that this is an activity done by elites. And our typical traditional definition of it, and who's at the table setting the rules and setting the terms of engagement tend to be either corporate or political elites. And you just talked about how it's happening at every sector of society. So maybe we can talk about how the old definitions of agency have limited our understanding of it. And this new definition of who gets to sit at the table, who has agency, who can participate is much broader. Maybe that can help us better understand what you're talking about in terms of these new paradigms of agency.
I think it's important. You gave a very good example. The FOCAC agenda setting, and I wanted to take the example of the Dakar summit that took place. I think it was during COVID, and there was in that context something new that scholars noticed was how civil society, local civil society, also provided input to the agenda. It was maybe not very public, but there were several committees of civic actors coming together and drafting a few position papers, that were sent to the leaders, and on matters related to trade, matters related to whether it's Africa-China engagement in education, but also asking for more transparency in the relationship, and also asking for their governments to be able to find the right frameworks to monitor this relationship. I know that NEPAD, for instance, so that is not African Union Development Agency, is very much involved in establishing and following up with this monitoring process. So that is very important. Now, coming back to the exercise of agency based on these examples, it is true that there used to be like a large categorization of state, non-state agency, and a local agency, or elite agency. I think that much of this literature categorizes agency into these large, what I call sponge types, although they might look from an outset as very defined. But take the example of state and non-state agency. Within the state, you have so many different actors. You have the president, the presidential cabinet, so the executive power, parliamentarians, bureaucrats, the ones, let's say, implementing these and also participating in the negotiation of the process. And so this variety of African actors within the state apparatus, or across also non-state actors, they have different modalities. They have also different impact. So various actors within these categories exercise agency differently, but also with different motivations. And they use also different repertoires of action. A bureaucrat cannot have the same repertoire of actions like the president. That's why I came up with these subcategories.
Okay, well, let's pick up the discussion there. You've teased a little bit of what we want to talk about in your article, where you separate 5 different kinds of agency, these different actors. You talked about presidential, bureaucratic, executive. Well, let's start with presidential agency. Of course, that's the one that I think comes to mind when we see John Mahama going to Beijing, talking with Xi Jinping. Let's start with presidential. What is it, and what is it that we're not understanding in this concept?
So, I think there is a general understanding. I also think that the early definitions of agency very much focused on the presidential role, right? Who has, especially in presidential regimes, has most of the influence, especially when it comes to foreign relations. So. Why did I put separately individual agency by, let's say, the president? I think that the president definitely has a very strong power when it comes to, defining the relationship, coming up with the decision, deciding also which constituency might, receive the different project. And so presidential agency here is exercised through direct interventions, also increased monitoring of the project. There are several articles that really investigated the SGR railway project in Kenya. That's a very good example of presidential agency. And it's also the different ways by which this increased monitoring allows to bypass the bureaucracy, co-opting sometimes opposition leaders, offering rewards, but also sanctions, to induce these greater efforts in agents and generate also in some cases this sense of mission. And in the article, I really took different examples of presidential agency here by looking in different scenarios, whether it's Sierra Leone, Kenya, how the president has intervened for different motives. That's why I always talk about, the intentionality. It's very important to keep that in mind from the start. How this intentionality is not always or can be very much about self-interest for political motives, but also in some cases directed to others.
So there was research done several years ago that showed that a disproportionate amount of Chinese investment would go into the home provinces or regions of the president or prime minister or the ruler. Is that an example of how presidential agency is exercised, that they can divert investments and money and resources into their home provinces, such as the former Nigerian president put the new Chinese funded railway university in his home province? And so is that an example of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, when it comes to, let's say, directing agency towards self-interest, definitely that's an example of it. It allows for, using this special relationship with China for their own interests, and not necessarily because we are talking also about public money when, the project is funded on national budget. But in the case of loans, it's also something that populations will have, in one way or another to pay back via taxes and so on. So that's also definitely an example. And that's why I think it's important to move beyond the celebratory accounts of agency. Agency seems to be, in some cases, very much celebrated virtually in different contexts. But the example that you're taking here shows that it can be, it's not necessarily positive, and it's definitely, in some cases at least, geared towards self-interest and political motives.
So, Folashadé, that's very interesting, but it's a little bit confusing because presidential agency sounds a lot like your second type of agency, which is executive agency. Those are the ministers, presidential cabinet members, senior advisors. And you kind of specifically highlight that they're there during a time-bound period, usually during the term of the leader. What's the difference between presidential agency and executive agency if it's the president that's appointing those ministers and those executives?
I would say that these actors, within the presidential cabinet, and I'm also bringing here like the senior advisors, for instance, and some ministers as well. They also exercise a high level of influence in the specific space that they operate. They are guided also by a certain mission that is, sometimes, let's say, often it's a presidential roadmap, but in some cases, they also have their own agenda, I would say. Some of the examples that I took here is that the repertoires of action that they combine, rhetoric mobilization, but also interventions or different sanctions in some cases. And these actors, the example that I took is how they reconstruct, for instance, and strategize the China model in their different in their different interventions to serve their bilateral relationships with China, and also with some of the different for some of the domestic interests. I think that there's a continuity with from presidential agency with the different executive members, but it is important to look at these actors also, because in some cases they participate also in in the China model example, they also participate in legitimizing policies that guarantee some kind of a regime survival. For instance, when they put a heavy focus on infrastructure for economic development, for instance, or how, the dissemination of resources to elites without political conditionalities. So I think it's important to keep in mind that these actors can also have their own agenda. They are sometimes in competition with one another. And in some cases, and especially in the African setting, it's the president that puts sometimes, and I took the article that you mentioned from 2019 really shows that in some settings, it's the president that puts his own cabinet members into competition in order to get as much as possible finance from China for funding different infrastructure projects. So I think it's important to look at these specific actors as well in the way they execute orders and implement policies as well. And they play a key role in Africa-China relations beyond the president.
Sure. Well, let's move down the hierarchy from presidential to executive to the bureaucracy. And you specifically highlight Benin and Ethiopia as examples of what you call bureaucratic agency.
Yes. So in the case of bureaucratic agency, the bureaucrats are very much at the lower, I would say, level of the government. They are civil servants. So their role is often to stay quiet, to participate technically in the negotiations, and to implement the decisions that have been taken. And something that I notice here using the example of Benin here is that they are also able when they do not necessarily agree with what is happening and with this very top-down approach, they get out of their role of just executing agents, and they are able also to, contest sometimes the relationship by opposing it. And I took the example of Benin here by using, the internal discontent from the administration under Boyani and what civil servants considered as missteps in the relationship. Like medical for tenders were not negotiated. They were evading tender processes for Chinese contractors, and they were favoring them and asking also for speedy execution, which is crucial, especially in electoral context. And so bureaucrats were able to exercise agency by coalescing with also other actors, and they really acted as gatekeepers for the effective implementation of the rule of law. And also to avoid being accused later by local populations of mismanagement and incompetence should an accident arise from the use of faulty infrastructure. And in the case of Ethiopia, I also used the literature that is out there to show that favorable clause in the negotiation process, bureaucrats can intervene to create favorable clauses for job creation, technology transfer in the contracts, and to make this happen and really follow up so that this is effectively implemented. But one thing I also wanted to say here, whether it's, especially in the case of bureaucratic agency, is that it depends on the type of regimes that we are talking about. In the case of democratic regimes, it is more, let's say, possible for vocal opposition or even more tactical forms of agency that I mentioned here. And this democratic setting allowed for, in the case of Benin, for the exercise of agency via different coalition building, mobilization of civil society, mobilization of the press, using a radio show host. It's a little bit more difficult in autocratic settings where civil society is not as, it is present, but not necessarily given, the platform to express in a freely manner.
In for several of the different typologies of agency, you mentioned that that they are pluri-intentional. So I was wondering what you meant by that, and what kind of implication that has in this discussion.
So by pluri-intentional, I refer to the initial definition that I mentioned at the beginning here of agency, and that is that the intentionality behind it, the why is agency exercised here. There's no single answer. There are various definitions. Look, we have been talking now about individual agency, executive agency, bureaucratic agency, looking at these various actors. They do not have the same motives. So the intentionality here can be multiple. It can be directed towards self-interest, but it can also be directed to like building better negotiation frameworks or making sure that within the contract, negotiating the contract in a certain way that it is to the advantage of the population, that it leads to job creation, technology transfer, and so on. So any question or any study on agency needs to question the intentionality, but also to whom it is directed, this exercise of agency.
Yeah. Well, the last two that we're going to focus on are really the people who are traditionally not expected to be at the table. And this is civil society and civic agency. And you have organized and non-organized. Maybe you could talk to us about civic agency and the important role that they play in this relationship.
Yes. So what I wanted to highlight here by taking the example of civic agency here and also of civil society is that when it comes to defining civil society in the larger context, even beyond Africa-China relationship, it's important to note that civil society it's not limited to the official NGOs. Right? There are so many various actors within the larger civil society category. And keeping that in mind, meaning that there are trade unions, different types of associations, the formal NGOs, but also artists, cartoonists, they are all part of the larger civil society. So it's important from the African perspective, at least, not to look at civil society only as something formal. And here I refer also to what I said at the beginning of our conversation on the necessity to look at both formal and informal action. And so coming back to that, in the case of looking at civic agency also requires to look at how these various actors are exercising agency, these civic actors, sometimes in a very organized way. Like trade unions, you were talking about AFTA earlier, so formal trade unions, NGOs, civic coalition, to balance the power of the state. But there's also more, let's say, semi or non-organized civic agency by actors that are sometimes more, say, bottom-up or resistance movements. And this can happen in an organized way by leading a coalition, but it can also be just sporadic riots on infrastructure project sites where the workers are not necessarily happy with their conditions, and they start a riot. That's not necessarily pre-organized. It is the exercise of agency as well. So I think it's important to make this different categorization, and to the idea here behind this typology is to really, in order to have a more granular analysis of agency in Africa-China relations, it's important to look at these different types. I chose like an actors-based typology, but it can be in other cases something else, like action-based or process-based, right? And one thing that I want to say here also is that all these various forms of agency and types of agency, they do not necessarily operate in silos or in separate spaces. They can result in joint agency or what some authors like Shipai have called co-agency. The example of Benin that I took, where coalition building was set up by bureaucrats through different coalitions and alliances with civil society, for instance, even with radio show hosts, with other unions as well. Here you have a combination of bureaucratic agency and civic agency, that is organized civic agency that is taking place. So it shows that these types of agency do not necessarily evolve in separate spaces, but agency can also be exercised jointly, by a various set of actors.
And so like a lot of these typologies, obviously that you've analyzed, they are universal to many states, to most states. But have you found specific kind of like how much of this analysis struck you as being Africa specific, and how much of it is or which aspects of it were kind of did you feel particularly resonated within African states, and which of these like broader kind of like approach to agency can also be expanded to, say, other parts of the global south or other countries kind of also dealing with China?
Well, I think what I wanted to show here is that very often, going from the caveat, yes, the caveat that agency in the African context is always about resistance. It's always about, oppositional postures, and that in other parts of the world, it's more diversified, that there are more actors involved. What I wanted to show here is really contributing to the analysis of non-Western agency in international studies by showing how African agency, just like everywhere else, is also, as you said, pluri-intentional, polymorphous, and goes beyond just resistance and oppositional postures, depending on the actors involved and also depending on the political, economic, and social context wherein it is exercised. So I think that's really one of the main, let's say, comparisons, is that maybe in some settings in Africa, as you mentioned from the beginning of this, our conversation, we are talking about so many different countries and within them different actors, different political regimes. So Africa's agency is something very large. That's why there's a need to unpack it first, locate it, unpack it, but also categorize it. And that's the objective here in this article, to come up with, a proper typology composed of different types of actors, and to show this, the polymorphous nature of agency. And one thing I also wanted to say in the African context is that using a typological analysis really allows to avoid three main caveats here. The first one that I mentioned, and that we mentioned throughout the show, that is moving beyond large categories of state, non-state agency, and look, within the state apparatus, what is happening here? Are they talking with one voice necessarily, or what are different actors doing? How are they exercising agency within the state or non-state actors? The second caveat here is really moving or not making celebratory accounts of agency. No, it's not always positive, as we said. It's not the state versus the dominated subalterns. It moves beyond that. And the third one, and that is equally important, is to also avoid providing this unidimensional analysis of agency only as something that is directed towards the states or the hegemon, and by really looking at the pluri-intentionality, as we said earlier, of the exercise of agency by different African.
The article is The Study of Agency in Africa-China Relations, the Case for Typologies. As with everything that Folashadé writes, it's absolutely essential reading and provides this nuance and this level of understanding that you just can't find anywhere else. We're going to put a link to it in the show notes. Again, I highly recommend it. Folashadé, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your insights. Folashadé is a senior research associate at the Global Economic Governance Program in the School of Government at the University of Oxford. Once again, Folashadé, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you, for having.
Cobus, one other thing I want to mention is that the article that we're highlighting in the show notes by Folashadé is open access. That means everybody can get it. That's not a given with academic articles. So It's very important. And, it's funny when I give talks on this topic and when you talk as well, I often refer to Folashadé's research. In many ways, it is the benchmark for understanding these questions of negotiations and agencies. One of the things that I have found over the years in the discourse from the West about China-Africa relations is it frames African stakeholders as the victim. The menacing Chinese are coming in and negotiating these horrific deals with Africans. They're being burdened with debts. And there's two things that I find interesting about this debate from a Western perspective. Number one is it disempowers Africans. And this is what Folashadé's research, I think, completely shatters, is that the African delegations at very different levels of society, she's pointing out in this article, have an enormous amount of influence in shaping the discourse. At the same time, the way that this Western narrative is presented as the Africa's victim simply isn't accurate either, because as we're talking about presidential agency, for example, in the SGR case, the decision not to follow the law and the decision to keep the loan contract secret was absolutely within the power of the presidents, both President Ruto and President Kenyatta before him. So agency swings both ways. It swings from empowerment, but also accountability. And in that sense, by making Africans and African leaders the victims, it removes that accountability question.
Yes, definitely. So I fully agree. The other take that I've heard frequently and quite often nowadays, particularly from US, I've heard it from both US, high level US and European stakeholders, is this idea that China just bribes its way in to Africa. So that there is a form of leadership agency happening, but it's all negative. It's no agency is being exercised in trying to make Chinese projects better. It's only negative agency is only being kind of directed in order, for self-enrichment. And I think Folashadé's work really also challenges that kind of flattening. Of course, corruption and extroversion are forms of agency, of the exercise of agency, but they're only one of many forms. And that is only one of many dynamics, in not the only one, in the China-Africa interaction. And I think that's really important. I think it's important to pass these differences between the many African actors, like government actors, who are actually trying to make a sustainable project that will continue and have developmental impacts, and those who don't. And that is that they are both kinds in the mix. So kind of making that distinction is really important.
100%. Can't agree more. That's again why Folashadé's work, in many ways, I think of her as the GOAT in all of this. The greatest of all time, in case people aren't familiar with the acronym, because the work is so essential in understanding the relationship. And I don't know you've heard these from US and European stakeholders, these, that the Chinese bribed their way in, and we hear it in the Capitol Hill testimonies all the time, how disempowering, how patronizing, how condescending it is. I remember a few years ago, maybe it's about 5 or 6 years ago, you and I had on the show a representative of the Ghanaian Ministry of Finance to talk to us about the $2 billion bauxite for infrastructure deal. And what was so interesting about his point of view was how intentional everything was. How strategic it was. How are they going to access capital? How are they going to leverage their resources in such a way that it didn't create debt? And again, this is the type of decision-making and policy-making that's happening in capitals across the continent. And again, throughout the global South, that undermines this narrative from the West that, again, the Chinese are just these malign actors who are bribing their way in, because again, that disempowers the host government or the host agency at all different levels. And it's far more textured and nuanced. And I hope people in both sides of it, all sides of this, are listening to the show to understand the complexities of this relationship.
Yeah, I fully agree. You know, and also to appreciate the larger kind of complexities that face Africa, you know, in the world, you know, because, you know, for example, like, you know, bribery and corruption is a problem in Africa, of course, but it's a much smaller problem, by orders of magnitude smaller than the evasion of taxes by multinational corporations, right? Kind of like that is a much larger outflow of money out of the continent, through, you know, mining companies misreporting, you know, hauls, for example, like that kind of, you know, so that sense, like this kind of flattening of the discussion around, you know, like I think the like agency and the larger kind of like lack of agency that Africa faces in, you know, kind of in a global economic system, like Folashadé and other scholars who work on agency, they feed into that larger kind of awareness of these issues, you know, so on this broader kind of meta level, I think it's also really important.
Okay, Cobus, well, let's leave it there. Thank you very much for your insights and your time. And as always, if you would like to follow the work that Cobus is doing and the entire team at the China Global South Project, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe, and you'll be able to sign up for really what is the best resource available on this topic. Nobody goes into the kind of detail that we do and the breadth that our team in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and now Latin America. We have a new Spanish service, China en las Americas, who is up and running on our Spanish site as well. Again, a link to that is in the show notes if you speak Spanish. But this is unique in the marketplace, and it requires your support for independent, agenda-free, fact-based reporting. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Again, if you are a student or teacher, we'll give you half off. Email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com. Once again, we'll put a link to Folashadé's article in the show notes, and you can find more on this topic over on our website. But we'll be back again next week with another episode of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening and for watching.